right up to the present. As Alan kindly pointed out, we're not academics, although of course one naval officer has become an academic, but the rest of us are humble diplomats and politicians. So we're going to be on time, Alan. Thank you very much. And indeed, I noticed looking at the itinerary that you've encouraged me to be on time, because after my name it says chair till 11:50. So, and I'm the only one that seems to have a time actually put down next to their name. But that's because Methodist lay preachers, lawyers and politicians need to be reminded of the importance of keeping their remarks brief. But I am just going to say a couple of words by way of introduction. And first of all, to fess up, I am a graduate of the US International Visitors Leaders Program. Now, that I think is an underappreciated initiative of the State Department. It goes way back to the 1940s, and I became a member of this distinguished little group way back in 1981, 82. So you've got to imagine afro, flares, and all that comes with it. Don't laugh too much, Mitch, thank you very much. And all that comes with that. But the important thing about that visitors program is that it isn't actually, it's not about high politics. It's about people and the relationships between people. And it's designed to give a group of people who are invited by the ambassadors all over the world in their countries just to go to the United States for 3 weeks. You can do whatever you want, but you've got to spend 3 days at the beginning in the State Department. And I formed relationships there with people in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Washington, in New York, and in the place they always allow you to go to. They tell you when they invite you to join this program, you can go somewhere where just go for the fun of it. And I went to Santa Fe. I've never been to Santa Fe. I've never been to America before, but Santa Fe would sort of capture my imagination because of cowboy movies. And I met there a lawyer involved in indigenous land rights, Happy Rockefeller's personal assistant too. And those relationships, frankly, have stuck with me all 40 years plus since. And that's why Winston Churchill founded the English-speaking Union. It was about relationships between peoples. So whilst rightly we've been talking about the special relationship in terms of the relationship between heads of government and maybe security and armed forces, actually the special relationship is about a relationship between peoples, English-speaking peoples. And that, I would argue, actually is what cements the special relationship. It's interesting that, today, anyone who thought this was just simply an academic and sort of romantic, emotional spasm about the special relationship, we wake up to the news and it's in the headlines. It's in the headlines because of politics. And because someone has chosen to suggest that somehow the relationship is threatened because some Labour staffers have gone over to the US to participate in the election. Well, of course, Labour and Conservative staffers have been going over to the US, and Republican and Democrat staffers have been coming over to the UK for elections for many, many years. There's nothing new about that. And the special relationship, quotes unquote, persists. Indeed, during the period of Clinton and Major and their relationship, Clinton never forgot that some people had come over from Conservative HQ and taken a rather interesting role with the Republican Party against his candidacy, and in the course of his election campaign. The relationship nevertheless persisted, and I would argue that that relationship has never been more important than at this moment. But at the same time, I would argue that the reason why it's never been more important than, in fact, since the Second World War is because we are facing an existential challenge in terms of our values from China and from Russia. And, you know, you've only got to look at the meeting that's taking place at the moment. 37 world leaders have beaten their way to Putin's door and are meeting there as we speak around the BRICS axis. Meeting, incidentally, at the same time as English-speaking peoples of the world in the Commonwealth are gathering in Samoa. And therefore, actually, the relationships that form the special relationships, not just the relationships of heads of government, not just the relationships of the civil service, security and military apparatus, but all those relationships, relationships around trade, relationships around culture. In another part of my life, I'm on the board of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. We have the US Friends of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. Every major British cultural organisation will have US friends. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra has UK friends of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. This is about the relationship between peoples. Looking around you, if we look around each other here, it's the relationship between us all. That's at the bedrock. That is the bedrock of the special relationship. This place, the fact that this university has chosen this place as a place where it will bring students and young people together for the next generation. That's what the special relationship is about. But I'll say just this finally, before we go on to our conversation, and I ask Ambassador Rice to come up and just share a few words with you. I'll give you my take on the special relationship on the ground, because you know it hasn't always been an easy one, and I think we've got to be upfront about that. I mean, we were talking earlier on about the relationship between Thatcher and Reagan. Now, you know, I can remember the relationship between Thatcher and Reagan over Grenada. Now, you know, when a sovereign Commonwealth country was invaded, and Thatcher went through the roof. She was livid. And what was said at the time, and that was the story given, was, well, you know, we forgot. We forgot. You know, what does that actually say about the depth of the special relationship? We would be unwise if we were to forget the circumstances of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Doha Agreement, the protocols of the Doha Agreement, the extent to which Europe and the UK included felt blindsided by that, in which the sacrifice and our close cooperation during that period was not perhaps recognised in terms of sharing in the way that it might be. But of course we've built back on that relationship since in the coming together around Ukraine. And it is important, it is vitally important that we continue to work together on Ukraine, whatever happens in the election in a couple of weeks' time. because what's happening in Ukraine is a clash of values. It's also an existential threat to us all. And I'm an Atlanticist. I suspect everyone in this room is an Atlanticist. But, you know, we shouldn't forget that as we speak, China is building a base in the South Atlantic. We shouldn't forget on the west coast of Africa. We shouldn't forget, as we speak, China owns a newspaper in the Caribbean. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. And that is on the United States doorstep. And so, Atlanticism is just so crucial. And it was Atlanticism, I move on now to turn to Ambassador Rice. It was Atlanticism, the sense of shared values and a shared history that brought us together around Northern Ireland and seeking to have a settlement for the island of Ireland that would hold. And it has held, despite everything. And one of the reasons why it came about was because of that special relationship. And perhaps no one individual did as much as Ambassador is in making sure that that did happen. And we owe him a huge debt of gratitude. And we're delighted to be listening to him this morning. Over to you.
Thank you, Lord Boateng, Professor Packwood, Holly, James, and everyone here for inviting me to this wonderful venue and for your very generous hospitality. I am the current chairman of the International Churchill Society, and therefore, like Matthew Palmer, I am legally required to say something about Winston Churchill anytime I speak in public. Today, I've been asked to discuss the role that Ireland has played in US-UK relations. And as Lord Boateng mentioned, I want to focus on the Northern Ireland peace process. Candidly, the US and the UK have had some disagreements in the past over how this peace process should be conducted, or even whether the United States should be involved at all. On my very first day as President George W. Bush's special envoy to the peace process, I was asked by an irate Ian Paisley Sr., what business did the United States have in Northern Ireland? Why was I even at the table? I'm pretty sure it was a rhetorical question. More seriously, and most famously, the British became very upset when President Clinton granted Gerry Adams a visa to come to the United States in 1994, at a time when the IRA was still active and armed. Ironically, just over a decade later, the British government would completely reverse itself, insisting this time that Adams must be granted a visa to the United States after the United States had decided not to do so until Adams publicly supported the policing and justice systems that were being implemented in Northern Ireland. Prime Minister Blair was only minutes away from personally intervening on Adams's behalf by calling President Bush before Downing Street was persuaded to stand down. Adams did not get the visa, and the pressure worked. He publicly endorsed policing and justice, and the peace process advanced. But it's important to note that these Anglo-American stats were outliers. For the great majority of the peace process, the US worked closely with an array of British officials, civil servants, police and security officers. Foremost on the American side was Senator George Mitchell, who worked tirelessly over many years to bring together all the political parties in Northern Ireland to sign the Good Friday Agreement. And subsequent American special envoys all worked closely with Irish and British prime ministers and their teams to implement the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, finally standing up Stormont in 2007 with Ian Paisley Sr. as First Minister and Mark McGuinness as his deputy. No less helpful were hundreds of Irish Americans who labored behind the scenes to advance the peace process. And some deserve special mention for the influential roles they played. Bill Flynn, Bruce Morrison, and Chuck Feeney are not widely known, but they kept hope alive and the channels of communication open when the official talks struggled. Today, Northern Ireland is not perfect. I know, as I've been devoting the past 8 years to working for the UK government on helping to end the remnants of paramilitarism in Northern Ireland. I think it says something special about the special relationship that an American was asked to serve as the UK's representative in this effort. Although my British mother-in-law did ask me, why did they have to pick an American? Couldn't the government find someone British to do this? Now, the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process represent something rare and precious, a success story that was born out of cooperation, collaboration, and that all-important factor we've heard this morning, trust, between the United States and the UK. And Americans are rightly proud of this diplomatic victory. Now, undoubtedly, there will be disagreements in the years ahead as the US continues to try to help the people of Northern Ireland realize the full potential of the Good Friday Agreement. After all, there are 31.5 million Americans who claim Irish ancestry, 1 out of every 10 Americans, and many follow events on the island very closely. Every US president, no matter what their political party, will be sensitive to this constituency. But it's important to dispel a myth that has been promoted by some intellectually lazy media, that President Biden hates the British. Now, I understand why it may seem true to some. After all, the president wears his Irish ancestry on his sleeve proudly, and his administration made clear that the US would not engage in negotiations for a free trade agreement with the UK due to disagreements over how Northern Ireland might be treated in a post-Brexit dispensation. In short, Washington was worried that London would jeopardize the Good Friday Agreement. But it's important to note that President Biden has already met twice with Prime Minister Starmer, and he met more times with Prime Minister Sunak than he did with any other world leader. Regardless of who sits in number 10, relations between the US and the UK are closer in the military intelligence spheres than with any other country in the world, as we've heard earlier today and last night, the comments with Nicholas Soames. This is true today, and I believe it's going to remain true for many, many years in the future. In fact, I believe that Ireland should no longer be viewed as a source of disagreement, but rather as a source of shared interests between the US and the UK. While tactics may sometimes vary, promoting peace in Ireland is a common strategic goal of both our countries. Like Churchill did so many years ago, and I warned you I had to work in this reference, both the US and Britain have embraced the consent principle as the bedrock of the peace process and the basis for any future unification, North and South. In other words, Ireland has gone from being a weakness to a strength in Anglo-American relations. Now, unification may or may not come one day, but the Irish peace process has already worked to further unify our two countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Mitchell. Thank you. And thank you for your service to the Anglo-Irish Peace Accord. We are preoccupied in Parliament with the special relationship, and it's worth taking a look, those of you who follow these things, particularly the students amongst us. At last year's report, special relationship US, UK and NATO. And this is a report of the House of Commons. And the first line in the report says this, and I'm going to read it to you. The UK-US relationship in defence, security and intelligence is strong and enduring. Our armed forces have fought alongside in many campaigns post-1945 and continue to work together on development of both equipment and doctrine. That's the first line, the central finding of this inquiry conducted by the Select Committee in the Commons. someone whose life has really embodied the special relationship in the context in which the report puts it, is Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Perry. And it's that combination of I'm going to you now actually, because we're going to come to Suzanne at the end. Okay, good. You're right. That's the chairman's prerogative. And Chris's life, both as a naval man, a man of action, and as an academic, really embodies the special relationship. A former NATO commander, someone who has really made a contribution at every level, both as a man of action and as an academic. And I think it will be important for us to hear from him now. I'm hugely grateful to you for making time. That's all.
Well, thank you, Paul. You're demonstrating there von Moltke's military principle that no plan survives first contact with the audience. So there we go. I'm going to stand in front of you and say there's nothing so special in this relationship as the military, because actually the relationship has been forged in blood over many years, from the Second World War onwards, right up to the recent conflicts. And Paul's right, the relationship subsists, its lifeblood, if you like, is the intelligence relationship, exchanges. We have many officers in the United Kingdom serving from the American Armed Forces. We have them in the United States. I did a 3-month exchange on F-14s in San Diego during my time. We're aligned on doctrine and concepts. We're congruent in our military forces, the way of war that we fight. The components of our fighting power, physical, conceptual and moral, are the same. We have shared interests in research and development, and of course in the nuclear field, the UK is utterly dependent on the United States for its nuclear doctrine, but also its Trident missiles, even though we have independent targeting and of course our own warheads and submarines. And I go so far as to say that if we're thrown out of Scotland, the only place we can base our ballistic submarines is probably Kings Bay in Georgia, because there's nowhere else in the United Kingdom that is really suitable for basing them. I think if we look at the world today, and Paul's and everybody else has hinted at it, we would look at fears and insights that Churchill himself will have recognised. And it looks a lot like the 1930s. What we've got is two blocks. We've got the maritime democracies, the United States, Canada, parts of Europe, the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea on one side. We've got Russia, China, Iran, North Korea on the other. And you've got about 152 other countries in between thinking which way are we going to face. And those countries are saying, look, I think we want development. We're going to have to look towards the Eurasian autocrats. And if we're looking for defence and security, it's probably towards the free world. But there's this constant seesawing, and again, the BRICS conference with 37 of those countries there is expressing that ambivalence. But the fact of life is, our opponents are saying in their own words, they're modernising and mobilising in the face of the current situation. They've all got internal weaknesses, they fear the West and its values, and you've seen where the weaknesses are. But the problem is, just like in Orwell's 1984, they're externalising their internal problems by focusing on the other. And I'm going to quote Churchill too, you can't help but do it. He said in 1937, ahead of the Second World War, in a very similar situation, dictators ride to and fro upon tigers which they dare not dismount. And the tigers are getting hungry. And that is the world we're facing today, ladies and gentlemen. I'm 70 years old. I've had a great life. I've been free of the sort of things that my parents had to worry about. But we're in this world again today. And I would say to you in geopolitical terms that the world island that is Eurasia is confronting the world ocean represented by the maritime democracies. And that is the block that we are looking at. India may come towards us in the near future. But the fact of life is, unless the United States leads and the United Kingdom follows, we're going to have increasing conflicts, proxy and direct conflicts in that gap between the maritime democracies and the Eurasian autocrats. And the problem is we are not geared to the sort of coercion and war that is being threatened by the Eurasian autocrats, which we've seen in Ukraine, which we are seeing deployed by Iran and its proxies against Israel. We may soon see in the South and East China Sea in the Asia-Pacific region, and North Korea probably pushing on to South Korea. And be in no doubt, in their, I speak Russian, and in their documents and all their literature, they are saying they wish to dominate in energy, economic and geostrategic terms the continent of Eurasia and the waters around it. And the word that I see more than anything in Russian and Mandarin is they want to de-Americanize the world and its institutions. Nothing could be more straightforward. That is what we are facing. Now, what is threatening this at the moment for us? Well, one of the things is that the free world can't subsist without the United States in defence or security terms. It's as simple as that. The EU cannot fight. In fact, the motto of the EU, as far as I'm concerned, is can't fight, won't fight. Simple as that. And unless we have the United States on board, the United Kingdom, and the rest of the EU cannot actually resist this pressure from the Eurasian autocrats. I mean, Churchill again said it, you know, we are with Europe, but not of it. We're linked, but we're not comprised. We're interested and associated, but not absorbed. Well, that's a relationship that has served us well and still does today. But just to put it in perspective, do you know how much in your heads it would take to get our defence capability up to a level where we could resist Russia on our own without the United States? Can anybody give me a number in billions, a one-off cost? How much do you think it is? Stuart, you're not allowed to answer this. Anybody know?
100 billion. 100 billion.
Okay, it's 450 billion, a one-off, okay, to pay. Is that a big number? Yes? How much is the United States' annual defence budget? It's $900 billion, okay? So they get very sceptical when we say we can't afford to defend ourselves. So that relationship has got to be made a bit more special by us in Europe, and particularly the United Kingdom, in saying, look, we need to pay more for our defence. Why is that? Because since 2016, it's not just President Trump, but it was Robert Gates, and indeed the previous administration said, we need more help from our allies, because we can't do this job on our own. And the way I liken the old relationship was whenever there was a problem in the world, the Americans say, we're the sheriff, here's some deputies' badges, we're going to hand them out, we're going to form a posse and go after the bad guys. You and I call it a coalition, but the Americans call it a posse. Now, what has changed is the Americans are saying, unless you contribute more to your defence now, in Europe, in the Asia-Pacific, and other places, the posse ain't going to come. But what is going to come if you actually pay more is the US cavalry will be sent. And that's what we saw, if you remember, when Kim Jong-un threatened the rest of us with nuclear weapons, in particular Japan and South Korea, South America, for goodness sake. Now, one of the problems we've got is that in terms of actually resisting and deterring our opponents, we're becoming obsolete. And the sort of armed forces that we are putting up at the moment are not fit for future fights. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here. There's a real danger that in 5 years' time, everyone and everything on the surface of this planet is going to be detectable, either through its physical signature, its infrared signature, or the data exhaust that you push out from your devices. And that means everything will be targetable. We're seeing the democratization of weapons and weapon systems. You have Houthis using anti-ship missiles. You're having everybody from a garden shed upwards using drones. We're seeing ballistic missiles. And the prospect of nuclear release again on the battlefield. And I'll say to you now, the cost ratios of actually dealing with those sorts of systems are astronomical. So if you shoot down a missile in the Red Sea now, you are paying 12 times the amount for the missile you're using to shoot down the missile itself. 12 times the amount of the value of the missile. We are weak in space. We're seeing land systems deployed against sea systems. And, of course, we are seeing mass production by Russia and China of the sorts of ways of fighting wars. It takes us 8 years to build a frigate in this country. It takes 4 years, at the least, in America to build a frigate. It takes the Chinese 18 months. And in the last 3 years, they have built more ships for use at sea, for example, than the whole combined NATO navies. So, what are we going to do about this in the future? The fact of life is, the special relationship is going to have to remain special because we have to remain strong at sea. Why do we have to remain strong at sea? Because our opponents wish to dominate Eurasia. In that case, we have to maintain the dominance of what I call the watery World Wide Web, which is the sea. The sea is the physical manifestation of the World Wide Web. Everything that goes theoretically on the internet actually goes by sea or over it. And what makes it closer is the cables that carry the internet, of course, go by sea. So we have a massive interest in the sea. So if the free world doesn't actually commit to actually protecting the system based on the sea, which we call the international rules-based system, we are going to find ourselves isolated from the bulk of the world's trade and also all the other things that keep us safe. And I'm going to quote Churchill yet again and say, this is a world where we cannot be guaranteed to overmatch our opponents unless, as he said, we are as brave as lions and cunning as foxes. Thank you very much.
For your service in so many ways over so many years. And I just think, we needed to hear that from Max, because the threat is real and it is present. I was in West Africa just a few months ago when the cable mysteriously was cut. Nobody knows quite how, but it was cut. And it made a massive impact on the whole of the West African region. And lest anyone think, oh well, it's the West African region. Let's remember this, the fastest growing military presence in Africa is the Chinese People's Liberation Army. The fastest growing military presence. Let's not forget that as we speak, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in DRC, all of those countries which have strategic mineral wealth that is of immense significance and importance to this country and to the West. As we speak, the Wagner Group are operating in those 3 countries under the direct control of the industrial military complex in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So, this is real. This is real. And Churchill, in the Fulton, Missouri speech, referenced specifically the warnings that he had given in advance of the invasion of the Sudetenland. So we really do need to hear what we have heard from the last 2 presentations. We need also very much to hear what we are now going to hear from Suzanne Rain, who has served on that front line in Poland, in Iraq and in Pakistan, who has headed up the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre in our own country, and who brings a wealth of experience in this particular existential struggle. Over to you.
It's lovely to be here, and I'm going to talk quite simply about bombs on planes, because I think you're probably getting hungry and thinking about lunch, so I'm hoping to excite a bit. Article 5 of NATO. It has 14 articles to the treaty, but Article 5 is the one that everybody thinks about, where it states an armed attack against one or more of the member states shall be considered an attack on all of them. That's only been invoked one time in the history of NATO, and that was after 9/11. It was invoked in defence of the United States of America. So on the morning of the 12th of September 2001, NATO met in an emergency session, and that emergency session was chaired by Brit, George Robertson, now Lord Robertson. And that NATO response was a response of all NATO members, but the role of the United Kingdom in supporting the United States after that attack became a fundamental part of the US and UK posture for the next 20 years, which is sort of neatly titled the War on Terror, but it was a lot more complicated than that. So I'm going to talk about, very briefly, those 20 years, and I'm going to talk mostly about bombs on planes. On September the 17th, 2001, so only 6 days later, President George W. Bush authorised CIA to launch operations in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda and its host, the Taliban. And their mission was to work with Afghans who were resisting Taliban rule and to find Osama bin Laden. It actually took 10 years to find Osama bin Laden, which they eventually did in Abbottabad, the headquarters of the Pakistani army. You can draw from that what conclusions you will. But those 10 years saw a really rapid evolution of the terrorist threats in the US and in the UK, and the creation of really, really intense partnerships between capital cities in Washington and London, but also in the field, in Kabul, in Islamabad, in Baghdad, in Somalia, in Yemen, and by teams working across the internet in the English-speaking world. But Kevin, I think it was, quoted Churchill, I haven't got any my own Churchill quotes, but he said, influence in Washington depends on the possession of force. I would change that a little bit and say that during the War on Terror phase, Britain's influence in Washington also depended on the possession of threat, because that is what we did, actually. We realised when we had our own 7/7 bombing, 7th of July 2005, that the British Islamist population, the extremists among them who were also in large part members of Al-Qaeda, were a particular vulnerability to us, but also to the Americans, because they spoke fluent English, and because they had British passports, and because they could travel easily to the tribal areas on the boundary between Pakistan and Afghanistan, where they could be instructed and trained. And for those 10 years, that question about a British threat in terrorist terms was one that made the British security and intelligence agencies so fundamental to the American war on terror. So that relationship between the FBI and the British Security Service, between CIA and MI6, Britain's Overseas Intelligence Service, between GCHQ and NSA, was fundamental to the defence of America as well as to the defence of UK. It actually started pretty much straight away on December the 22nd, 2001, just a couple of months after 9/11. Richard Reed from Brixton boarded American Airlines Flight 63 from Paris to Miami with homemade bombs hidden in his shoes, and he tried to detonate them during the flight, but he couldn't light the fuse. Crew members restrained him, and the plane diverted to Logan International Airport in Boston, and Massachusetts State Police took him into custody. And he told them that he'd made the shoes himself. Who knows? In 2006, I was in Pakistan, I remember this, intelligence actually from the UK discovered a terrorist plot to detonate liquid explosives on transatlantic airliners flying between the UK and the US and Canada. And one of the key people behind that was a dual national British Pakistani called Rashid Rauf, who was eventually captured in Pakistan. and he was directly linked to the British jihadi community. The next serious threat was Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab, who was the Christmas Day airline bomber, 25th of December 2009, and he was a Nigerian who, again, at the age of 23, attempted to detonate plastic explosives hidden in his underwear while on board a flight from Amsterdam to Detroit. He had been supplied and equipped by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, so an Al-Qaeda group based in Yemen, and again, there was a very strong English language nexus to how AQAP, as we called them, was operating. That was led by a man called Anwar al-Awlaki, who was an American Yemeni, but who had also spent his formative years up and down mosques in the United Kingdom, recruiting and radicalising. So again, we had an absolutely joint, shared threat, shared need to act against him. The very next year, 2010, we had the printer bomb plot, where Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the same people, put 2 packages, each containing 300 to 400 grams of plastic explosives, so undetectable explosives, very clever technology, inside printer cartridges, which were sent as cargo on 2 transport planes, whose ultimate destination was America. And one was intercepted in Dubai, the other was intercepted by British police at East Midlands International Airport. It took them a very long time to find the explosives in the printer. First of all, they couldn't find them at all, and they had to go back and look again. And then they realised that it could have easily blown up the plane on the way to America. Again, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula claimed responsibility for that. And then in 2011, a would-be suicide attacker foiled a second underwear bomb plot, the Pants Bombers, as part of a joint US-UK operation to infiltrate Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and to fool them into giving away the secrets of how they were planning to blow up more transatlantic airliners. So I think the reason I've given you this list of bombs on planes that didn't happen is that those were all bombs on planes that would have happened had it not been for the partnership between the US and the UK. Neither nation could have defeated those on their own. It was the absolute sharing of information which enabled the discovery and thwarting of the plots before they happened. And that's been fundamental to everything, really. As the world has become the internet and all data has become fragmentary, everybody realised, and I think this was an American lead, that the only way you're going to find the bad guys if you are sharing your piece of the jigsaw with other people that you can trust to share their pieces of the jigsaw with you. And the second phase of the war on terror really began when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared his Islamic State in 2014. And that didn't really affect the Americans so much, because America was quite a long way away, but it massively affected us. And we had thousands of British nationals went eagerly to construct a new Islamist utopia in the Middle East. And we were completely dependent on American support to help us remove the threat that posed again directly to our streets. And during that time, I was head of the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, which was the body within the British government that did the UK's threat warning system. And I remember we had a terrible year in 2017 where we had 5 terrorist attacks in the UK, including the Manchester Arena bombing. And the closest working partnership that I had was with a man called Nick Rasmussen, who was head of the American National Counterterrorism Centre, NCTC, who provided constant support, analysis, having a partner that you can fact check everything with. You can say, this is what I think, do you agree? If you don't agree, why not? Let's think about it. Was absolutely fundamental to that British effort to then get on top of our own very difficult homegrown problems. And I just finished by noting that if we're talking about the closeness of that relationship, it was noteworthy September the 7th this year that Richard Moore, the chief of MI6, and Will Burns, the director of CIA, appeared together at the Financial Times Weekend Festival, the latest manifestation of the closeness of that relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, for that, but also for all you've done to keep us safe. Thank you very, very much. Right, now, Alan, we started 10 minutes late, just to get the record absolutely straight. Good. That means that we have got time for a conversation, for questions, for points from you all directed at us up here on the table. So, over to you. Questions, comments? Yes, young guy there.
Sorry. This is a question for Rear Admiral Chris Parry. How important is the defence of Taiwan to maritime political affairs, and do the US and UK see eye to eye on that subject?
Good, Chris?
Make sure I can get this on, otherwise I'll shout.
Do you want to come and stand here, Chris?
Okay, it's going to take 2 hours, okay? It's a really good question. Taiwan, let's get Taiwan straight here. Taiwan has never ever been part of China as such. It had a sort of independent existence, particularly the eastern side, and it was then ruled by the Japanese until the end of the Second World War. Oddly enough, it's included as part of the 9, 10 or 11 dash line that China puts around the South and East China Sea as part of its own sovereign territory. And let's be clear here, what China is saying is every other country has a 12-mile jurisdiction in accordance with international law. We have one that goes out to 1,500 miles. And that's unilateral, even though we've signed up to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And what we're saying effectively is that the South and East China Sea are China with a bit of water on top. And Taiwan is part of that. Now, Taiwan is absolutely critical in terms of what we call the first island chain that actually encloses the East and South China Sea. It comprises the Philippines, obviously Malaysia, but in the north, Taiwan. And what China is seeking to do is extend its defensive frontier 180 miles out to sea, so that in the South and East China Sea it can put a series of listening devices on the seabed to stop submarines going in. And also you've seen these coral atolls that have been converted now into essentially artificial islands that contain bases for ships, missiles and aircraft. So what they're trying to do is push that out. Now, the real issue associated with Taiwan is it's a democracy. It's got 32 million people. It produces 90% of the world's advanced superconductors. And the trains run on time. Now, just to give you a quick anecdote, I was outside the museum in Taipei where all the treasures of the Chinese sort of civilization are, because they went there with the nationalists in 1949. They were saved from being destroyed by the Cultural Revolution. I saw some mainland tourists and I went over to them and I said, what's not to like here? Democracy, trains running on time, 7% GDP growth, everybody happy. They said, we'd love to be like this, but we don't trust 1.2 billion people moving to this without the guidance of the party, of which is 96 million people in China. That's the issue. Now, why is Taiwan important? Okay, Taiwan is important because it's a member of what I call the free world. It's like Ukraine, it's like Israel. If these dominoes start to fall, then everything else is subject to coercion and also being taken over by these dictatorships. It also severely compromises our maritime position in the Pacific, because if Taiwan goes, the Philippines will say, we need to make an accommodation with China, and we have to recognise that China, and Xi Jinping is saying this, is we will recreate the conditions of the Ming Empire in the 15th century. He's saying that. And that means we're going to have a trade and tribute hub in the Asia Pacific, and we're going to have Belt and Road Initiative, which is the Silk Roads by land and sea across Eurasia. And by 2048, we're going to control everything under heaven. That's why Taiwan's important.
Thank you very much indeed. No room for doubt there.
So, I just wanted to ask, with a lot of the successes that you talked about with the special relationship, what do you see as the future threats to the special relationship? And then sort of follow up to that, are our enemies / adversaries / competitors, what are they currently doing, as you assess, to exploit those potential weaknesses?
Mitchell, why don't you take over?
So the greatest threat in the short term of the special relationship is a rising sense of isolationism among the American people. If we look at history, there's always been an isolationist element in the US, wondering why we should care about people beyond our borders, beyond the seas. But in the past few years, in particular, it's reached unprecedented heights. So recent polls show that over half of registered Republicans in the United States do not believe the United States should play a great role in world affairs. And a rising number of Democrats also feel the same. Now, what's interesting is that this is taking place at a time when the U.S. is doing very, very well economically. And I worry that should there be a downturn and rising unemployment, it will reinforce this sense of isolationism. We need to spend our money, our time, our attention on the problems that we have locally. So that, to me, is the greatest risk. The solution is to have leaders that understand the value of common values that we share, also common interests that we share with the UK and others. Those voices are relatively muted right now in the US. We are not hearing them, certainly not from President Trump. We're not hearing them either, mind you, from Vice President Harris. Again, that's, I think, the biggest short-term threat.
Thank you very much.
Can I say something very quickly?
Chris, yeah, in a moment, if you would.
What's relevant to the question?
Okay.
There is another issue. Diaspora populations in our respective countries that don't actually sign up to the sort of realpolitik and diplomatic links that we've had in the past. They don't share the tradition, they don't share the cultural values associated with it. Controversial, aren't they?
Right. The back.
Thank you. Fascinating panel today, or both the panels. My question is, there's an old kind of English saying that a successful marriage requires the adoption of two roles. One has to be the lover, and one has to be the loved. And whether that's true or not, I wonder if it's a fitting analogy for the special relationship in either historical or present day perspective. The question kind of carries a rider. Given Brexit and the diplomatic pivot of the US towards other parts of the world, like the Asia Pacific, are we becoming, the UK that is, are we becoming a little less special?
Yeah. But that presumes that the basis of marriage is always going to be love. The reality is that for very many centuries, marriages were often matters of convenience and policy. Certainly, the people who built some of the great houses in this county didn't marry for love. But Suzanne.
Hello, Tim. I think one of the reasons I sort of tried to stress the threat that English-speaking terrorists posed was precisely to make that point that the reason we were most useful to the Americans during the War on Terror was because, well, one, we could actually be useful and we knew stuff and we could help them, but secondly, they were worried about us. And I think that that is always one of the drivers for any kind of engagement overseas. You know, if they think that there is the potential that something is happening here that could threaten America, they're going to be more interested. And so we had the great benefit of having quite a lot of homegrown jihadis here that meant that they really wanted and it worked in lots of different ways, because we were able to teach them a lot actually as well from our possibly greater understanding of some of the complexities of the threat that maybe enables more nuanced responses in some ways.
Yeah. I'd also answer your question in this way. In good marriages, you have good communication and you listen to one another. And that's very important. Winston Churchill got that, hence the English-speaking Union, which he formed after the First World War, in terms of the importance of communication and listening. And when you don't listen, there are problems. And, you know, I fess up to this. I was a cabinet minister during the last Iraq war. You know, I sat with Jeremy Greenstock at meetings, and I know that Jeremy was not always listened to by his American counterparts. He knew what was going on the ground, but there were counterparts in America who were not prepared to listen to him. So you have to build the relationship, so it gets one trust, but also you have to keep your ears open, you've got to communicate and you've got to listen. But there's a question and point down there. Ah, right. Any more? Yeah.
Democracy is in the free world. But however, UK and US found that balance of the need for intelligence, security and defence with the democratic principles and liberties that we all have.
Anyone want to respond to that? Well, let me give you, while the panel are thinking about it, let me just give you a response based on my experience in Africa. We haven't always lived up to our values. If you look at history and look at the role of the West in the DRC, for instance, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the name actually says it, any country that calls itself democratic isn't. And I'm afraid Mobutu was installed on the basis that he was going to be friendly towards the West. Well, yes and no. He was friendly in the sense that he was prepared to work with Union Miniere and to sell out the mineral resources of the DRC to the West, but he certainly wasn't friendly to our values. And one of the challenges we face, and the Wagner Group is exploiting this, one of the challenges we face in Africa at this time is that unfortunately civil society hasn't been supported in ways that deliver employment to young people, hasn't been supported in ways that actually give them confidence in democracy. The result is that Wagner and others are able to work with military autocrats and replace the elected, quotes unquote, governments with governments that will do their will. So you're right. You know, one of the most important things, and again I go back to Churchill, he recognized this in the English-speaking Union. It was designed to inculcate the values that underpin democracy. So it's about using soft power in addition to your hard military power. And one of the things that Britain potentially offers to the special relationship is the Commonwealth, is a worldwide network of soft power that can underpin the values of democracy. So yes, there's a tension, you've identified it, but there's an answer to that. Any comments from further on the panel?
I was director of operations for rescuing 9 of our soldiers from a group called the West Side Boys. And they were a particularly noxious group, high on drugs. They were the bully boys of Liberia and that neighbourhood at the time. And we had 9 of our soldiers captured who basically got the navigation wrong. They'd given a map to an officer, which is always a mistake. And this Irish guardsman had managed to get them captured. Now the problem was there were a high number of variables involved in this, and getting them out was going to be very difficult. And Jeff Hoon was the Secretary of State at the time, And we said to him at the time, you know, we're going to have to create quite a lot of mayhem here, and we may have to involve killing quite a lot of people, because they're nasty people, these West Side boys. And without going into too much detail, we put our people in there. We lost one person, a chap called Brad Tinian, SAS, to get them out. Created a lot of mayhem, killed a lot of the West Side boys. But what was interesting, we said to Jeff Hoon at the time, you know, what's your risk appetite here in terms of the law and democracy? And he said, as long as we don't lose more people getting them out than going in, then I'm okay with it. It was a good decision, I have to say. But the fact that we had to kill lots of people in doing it was a function of the context itself. There was no way with all the variables that we could say we're going to minimise casualties. We had to use a lot of firepower. But here's the thing, here's the advantage. After we did that, the West Side boys were seen as the worst mafia group in West Africa. And everybody else afterwards said, did you see what the British just did to the West Side boys? We're going to behave. Right. So these things are not linear, they're quite messy sometimes.
Adam, we've got time for one more question. One more question. Someone on that side. Is anyone? Okay, this side.
It's not working.
No, we can't hear you. You hear, if America becomes more isolationist, where do we look to in order to build up the special relationship? Is that right? Yeah. Suzanne, would you like to?
Well, I don't know why I'm answering this one, but
Because
I think that I think this is clear that the UK's immediate security interests lie in working with other countries on the European continent to protect ourselves in Europe, and that work is already significantly underway, and it is obviously totally underpinned by American firepower and American attitude, I think. But if America backs off, I think that would just be what everyone expects coming to pass, which is that we know we have to do more ourselves here. So, particularly for the UK, the very close relationships with the Scandinavian countries and the Baltic countries and countries like Poland are ones that have been developed over many, many years now, and I think we're going to have to rely on working more closely with you. And I should also mention the French, again, who are Europe's most capable military power, and that has very strong relationships with the French as well. So it's not all about America. Sorry.
America won't go isolationist.
Chris and then Mitchell.
Isolationist. If America goes isolationist, we need to make an accommodation with Russia and China. Because Russia and China say if America departs from Europe, we will take over, and I quote, that tiny collection of states on the end of our continent.
Mitch?
I think the takeaway is that we all need to work harder to make sure that that day doesn't come to pass. Because whatever your interpretation, it certainly is not as congenial an outcome as the one we have now, which is the close cooperation between the US and the UK. So, on that note, I'd like to stop.
Okay. Did you want to make a point?
No, I would end on that note and move on.
Right. So we're moving on, but as we move on, let's just remember that at the end of the day, the relationship is about people. It's about all of you in this room. It's about us saying the relationship is important, and if we've got to pay more for it, we're going to pay more because our values matter. Thank you all very much for your contribution.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope I'm audible at the back in this spectacular echo chamber that we're sitting in. My name is John Rain. I'm the chair of the Marshall Aid Commemoration Commission, which, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's the body which oversees the Marshall Scholarship Programme. The Marshall Scholarship Programme was founded in 1953 by an Act of Parliament, and the Marshall Commission is a statutory body publicly funded. For those of you who pay your taxes, thank you. What do we do with your taxes? We turn them into scholarships for the very best of the United States graduate community. Every year, since 1953, the British government has paid for what was then 12, what is now 50, of the finest graduates in all subjects to come and study for 2 years in the UK at universities of choice on courses of their choice. I am no historian, but here is my historical analysis of how we got here. In 1953, the British government, Winston Churchill back again, decided that there should be some public act of gratitude towards the United States of America for saving us in the Second World War and then rebuilding us and rebuilding Europe with the Marshall Plan. So in return for that stupendous act of generosity and partnership on the part of the Americans, we gave them a scholarship scheme. I think at the end of the day, the Americans were up on the day because they got access to our greatest treasure, which is our intellectual and our academic history. Of course, numerically, financially, the Americans were quite a bit down on the day. The all-up sum of the Marshall Scholarship Programme is a minuscule £4.1 million a year of public funds. We are still giving those scholarships, and I say that because it's extraordinary that after 70 years, we've just celebrated our 70th anniversary, the cross-party sentiment in support of the Marshall Programme is so strong in the UK. There has never been a serious question as to whether we should be funding the world's richest country, funding their scholars from that country to come and study here. After all, they have the world's largest number of universities and the world's, I think out of the top 10, 8 are American universities. And that's because, a number of reasons. One, sentiment. Is that sentiment towards the US remains solid. Even though, as contributors have said earlier today, it has most definitely had its ups and downs. When it comes to formalised recognition of that relationship, sentiment I have found has been extraordinarily steady. Second, not just sentiment, but hard-nosed return on investment. Those scholars have gone on to do some truly remarkable things for their country, for our relationship, and for their areas of expertise. We happen to have, amongst the Nobel laureates announced earlier this month, a Marshall Scholar. John Palmer, Nobel laureate for chemistry. That's our third, I think. Some of you may be aware that Bill Barnes, whom Suzanne mentioned earlier, met the head of MI6, Richard Moore, recently. Bill Barnes was a Marshall Scholar. I'm afraid to say that Anthony Blinken wasn't a Marshall Scholar, but his deputy Kirk Campbell was. So in the field of public affairs and security, we have had an extraordinary return on the modest investment of funding 2 years of study in the UK. There's a deeper return, and another reason why there's been such strong support for this programme. And that is that every year in September, the waters of the Missouri, which I think is how Churchill described the lifeblood of the special relationship, flow through the magnificent Durbar Court of the Foreign Office, where they are received and congratulated and then dispatched to their universities. If we are to talk about the future of the special relationship, it resides very greatly in that pool of talent which arrives every fall in the UK. In 1953, when that pool of talent arrived, it was 12 people from very privileged backgrounds and from a very small number of very privileged universities. In turn, here they went to one of what were only 20 universities in the United Kingdom. There are now 50 scholars arriving each year, and over half of them come from diverse backgrounds socially, ethnically, racially, and in terms of how they choose to identify. They come from state universities, they come from historic black universities and colleges, they come from Ivy League universities too. And here they go to British universities from St Andrews down to Exeter. Of course, many of them are drawn to older and more famous universities. But they represent depth and breadth of contact between educational institutions and professional career paths both sides of the Atlantic. I spend most of my time in my day job thinking about geopolitics. It's a depressing business, as you may have picked up from some of our early contributors. I get enormous encouragement meeting young Americans who arrive every year here full of purpose, optimism, and with a deep commitment to those values of which many speakers here have made much today. I don't think that they would necessarily talk in terms of a special relationship. I think they would talk in terms of shared values. And I say that because each one of them arrives not just with a chosen course of study, but with a chosen cause. All of them are motivated to change the world, one way or another. That's an inspiring and a shared value. Part of our job on the Commission is to give them the opportunity and the intellectual means and the connections in order to do that. When I was asked to be the Chair of the Marshall Commission, a colleague of mine, I was serving on a board of a bank at the time, said, "Oh, well, that won't be particularly demanding, will it? Shouldn't take up more than a morning a week." I can tell you, it's hugely demanding because the Marshall Commission has the privilege of hosting a handful of trouble every year. When the Marshall scholars arrive, they are activists, agitators, they lean in so far they come out the other side. If they see it, they want to change it. When I first took over, I thought I'd bitten off more than I can chew here, and I'm getting out of higher education entirely. Now, I find the most stimulating part of what I do. I am glad that Public Pass funds every year a group of activists, agitating young Americans who want to change everything on their terms, who won't take no for an answer and want to know why. Why are things as they are? And how can we change them? So, if you ask me, how do I feel about the future of the special relationship? I feel very good about it indeed. It may not be something that I or anyone in this room recognise in years to come, but I think such are the shared commitments to all those values that make change possible, that give it guardrails, and that give it impetus, momentum, and that generate the genius to execute good ideas. All that, deeply shared, will all still be there when we're all long gone. And I hope that the Marshall programme will still be there too. So thank you for listening to me. I have a second duty today, and that is to sum up our final supremely distinguished speaker, Lord Peach. I've had the pleasure of working with Stu in many incarnations and count him a friend as well as a colleague and an inspiration. Stu's biography is in the pamphlet that you have here. Former Chief of the Defence Staff, former Chair of the Military Commission. Stu, there isn't simply time to go through all the things that you have done. Your qualifications for ending this seminar are supreme. I have great pleasure in handing over to you.
Thanks, John. Hello, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. First of all, can I say, on behalf of all of us, a big thank you not just to Harlaxton Manor for the way we've been treating last night and today, but also, Holly, if you could pass on the quality of the student body, and picking up Johnstein as my friend, the nourishment we all get from the presence of a US campus here in Lincolnshire, and the quality of the people that you bring from the United States, from many universities actually, to us in Lincolnshire, and I know that those of us who talk to the students really benefit. And this is a small part of Indiana in Lincolnshire, and of course the history of the manor is worth looking at while you're here. So what have we heard today? I feel required, after my other friend Matt Palmer has had to return to his very serious duties. And he said we had to quote Article 15, those British speakers, and make an American quote. And I would just simply, the quote attributed to Mark Twain was, of course, history don't repeat itself, but sure as hell rhymes. And I think our speakers today have been quite simply outstanding. All of them have, in turns, made that point. And there's much which we have heard today about the world we're in that would have been familiar to both President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill. And we can reach for analogies from the 1930s and the difficulties we face in the world. But the other thing I think has come out as a strong theme today is the weaponization of our language, the shared language of English through the English-speaking Union as a theme and a thread that has run through the day, all the way through to the Marshall Scholars and our own experience with the wonderful US students here. And it's that sort of essential relationship, I like that phrase, between people, thank you for raising that, Paul, which has, of course, made the theme, along with the quality of the historical research, the theme of the day. And of course there are many challenges. Chris Parry's brought many of them out. And when I did 50 years military service. And of course when I joined 50 years ago, national security was defined quite sharply and quite narrowly through a military I was joining, in my case the Royal Air Force, much of which was based in Lincolnshire at the time. And now I see a world at my age, now I'm nearly 70 myself, where national security now is much broader. We have to think about it much more broadly. Suzanne, you did that really well today, bringing that out, as to how our own knowledge and our own issues become part of the strength of the relationship, the essential relationship. Chris, you brought out the maritime posture. I'm also reminded of Mackinder, the famous geographer of over 100 years ago, with the rimland-heartland theory, which is similar to Chris's posture. And thank you for raising the cables issue. I remember being ridiculed as the Chief of Defence Staff for raising the cables and the threat to the cables in my annual address at the Royal United Services Institute. I'm not ridiculed now. Because those cables, if they're removed, they really change our way of life completely. And if you dig into this issue, you get more concerned. And those of you who know about it, we need to therefore protect our infrastructure, not something that gets much mention as part of that wider sense of national security. Food security. Again, thank you, Paul, for raising the African issues. There is so much about food security which rests on very slender and quite easily disruptive supply chains. And I've been privileged to work quietly in support of trying to get the grain out of Ukraine across a Black Sea region that Mr. Putin wants to contest. And actually our secret weapon in that case was persuading insurers to take a risk in minefields across the Black Sea. So maritime security is not just the ravings of military folk and older people. It is a really serious risk and threat to the world. And I think we need to take a UK-US approach to economic security and understand better our vulnerabilities as well as our strengths. I think today very many speakers have brought out those strengths, but there are many challenges. I had the privilege of following a great American into the senior military role in NATO, and he was General Omar Bradley. And he said, when he took the job that I had the privilege of holding, when NATO was formed, he said, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. I think Putin's war in Ukraine has reminded us that is true today. And the challenges we face in the globe and the way in which we should define our thinking about those challenges has never been more important. that great American, General Bradley, would he, along with General Eisenhower, first Supreme Allied Commander Europe, would they have thought that the NATO alliance would have celebrated its 75th birthday? Well, they may not have thought that, but they set it up for success. Along with General Montgomery, Field Marshal Montgomery, by then, who was Eisenhower's first deputy. So you have very powerful figures who come out from Alan's masterpiece in explaining that history, who set Euro-Atlantic Alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, for success. And sitting there for 3 years, in my case 2018 to 21, its success can be measured in a way of keeping 1.4 billion people safe and secure, now with 32 allies. So one of the consequences of Putin's illegal war in Ukraine is, to the surprise of many pundits, many commentators, Finland and Sweden are now full NATO allies and committed to Article 5, which simplifies much of NATO's command and control issues. At the same time, I had the privilege of chairing the Military Committee and seeing NATO adapt to a world. And again, this was a theme of the first panel. Adaptation, flexibility. And what do I mean by that? It's not just absorbing new allies, a semi-organic process, but also turning the hands of those responsible, charged with national security, as you've heard today all day, to new challenges. And there's plenty of them. But I don't think we should be downbeat and downhearted, because as John's just reminded us, as I see the students here, and I see the quality of the people we're attracting to UK Armed Forces, there are people now still willing to face that challenge and work together. The simple mantra in NATO was always, we're stronger together. It's very simple and it's very believable, because we are. And we mustn't give in to Putin. However tough he seems, however much he may be tempted to make accommodations, his vision of our world is toxic, dark and hollow. And as you've heard very powerfully from Chris Parry, the Eurasian issues that China and Xi are dealing out to the world are also attractive to some, but it is toxic and hollow. So the convening authority of our essential relationship remains. You've heard lots of little interesting and very important snippets today of how much that has evolved over time. The importance of peace processes, conflict mediation, again quoting Paul, and Ambassador, thank you for your service for peace. And those peace processes don't just happen, they don't just given to people. As a special envoy myself, of a very modest nature in the Balkan region, it's hard work. Creating peace and sustaining it is hard work and requires the sort of things that Suzanne was talking about, that back-channel approach, and check not just facts, but also checking understanding between two nations that can do this thing together. And I have hope in that future because of the quality of people we continue to attract. The other thing to say, which hasn't been said today, perhaps as much, is I think Winston Churchill's own career and the career of many of the US presidents also demonstrates a whole of society approach to security. And one of the things I think we need to think about is how we use reserves, how we use exchange officers in a more effective way, how we use these education programs to maximum effect. Because as I finish and leave us to any questions you may have for John and I think we have to speed up. We have to speed up our industrial production, whether it's a frigate, a UAV, or a new technique which is internet-based. We have to move faster. Again, Alan, Mr. Churchill, Sir Winston knew that. We have to speed up how we develop patents and keep our intellectual property safe in a world where China wants to steal it, which again is something that perhaps hadn't been predicted. But the sheer volume of the theft of intellectual property undertaken by the Chinese regime is something that the rules-based international system has to challenge. And remember what we've also heard this morning, where we need those young people to take this mantle, take this torch of this essential relationship forward, is to be that next generation of intellectuals and well-educated people who can dream up the things we can't dream up today, that make our advantage, that skill that you've heard, the strength of the US economy, that skill of the education programs knitting together to face these challenges. So I too agree with John. I have much hope for the future, largely drawn from students and many others, and largely drawn from the enduring experience that we've had together in NATO and other fora. The military matters. I have the closest relationship with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, just as Suzanne had, just as many of the other people who've held high posts I've had. And they are so important, and it's something that means we have to keep this essential relationship alive, and we all have to work at it. Thank you.
I think we've got time for just, we've got 15 minutes for questions. If anyone's got any final questions.
You discussed the importance of speeding up cycle times. History has always shown that democracies are very, very slow to do that until war happens. And when war happens, cycle times speed up immediately and very, very quickly. The US military in the Second World War was a classic example of that. Do we have to get that far until we start to get our act together?
That's a very well expressed question, and I think we do have to use that through both the defence review process we're undertaking, but also in order to support our friends in Ukraine. There's also a lot we can learn from each other. One of the things I did learn in NATO is not the UK has many strengths in industrial production and many ideas in defence, but is quite slow to take an idea through a patent to a reality. Our friends in Ukraine now have turned their entire, sitting in this beautiful room and the cedar paneling, taking their entire furniture manufacturing industry and turning it into making drones. And they're probably going to make, and nobody believes me on this number, probably almost 1 million drones this year, many of which will be almost instantly lost. But the fact they're doing it is my point, the fact they are at war and have geared up their production. Again, in answer to a previous question, people quoted our friends in Scandinavia. I think it's more than friends. It is the values. They are the values. They are the ways in which we can work together. We have a joint expeditionary force framework in which we can cooperate. And I think we should be much more shameless, again I learned this in NATO, of taking other people's good ideas and not continually reinventing our own. And I think that is something for the US and UK to do together. There are lots of people learning lessons from Ukraine and have to do that, and then apply them quickly. And the industry cannot be forced, but it can be influenced, it can be persuaded, and we can all be part of that process. But I am absolutely unashamed in saying we've got to speed up.
Any further questions? In which case, I suspect it probably falls on me just to say a huge thank you to all of the panellists today. And thank you so much for participating in this. And thank you again to Harlaxton for hosting what perhaps might become the first in a series of we could discuss that when everyone's recovered. But thank you all so much for coming, and I believe there is now we move to lunch, is that correct?
Yes, so there'll be some food and some further refreshments for more conversation through the secret passage, walk through the wall, and we will have that ready for you.
So the questions can continue informally over food, and Churchill would like that. Okay, thank you all.